Thank you so much for coming today. It is my great honor to introduce Jonathan Moore, who is an aquatic ecologist and assistant professor at Simon Fraser University in British Columbia. John grew up in Corvallis, Oregon, has a BA from Carleton College, and then returned to the West Coast. Right.
You got one chance there.
And then returned to the West Coast, where he completed a PhD at the University of Washington.
Yeah.
Okay. Over the past 4 years, John has cultivated relationships with First Nations groups during his time at Simon Fraser University. And he's provided important scientific evidence to inform a highly controversial debate over the fate of one of the largest remaining pristine watersheds in North America. Salmon ecology and conservation, however, are just one facet of his research program. And today he'll speak with us about the ecology and conservation of free-flowing rivers. After his talk last night, several people expressed interest in meeting with John and didn't have an opportunity to do so. If you are one of those, hang out after his talk today. There will be some time for you to talk with him then. But without further ado, I present Jonathan Moore.
Thank you. I'm going to dim the lights, I think. That's not bad. Nice. So again, it's a great honor to be here, and thank you all for coming. It's been a super fun visit. What you guys have going on here, it's pretty exciting. So be proud of yourselves. You're doing good stuff. So today what I'm going to do, last night I gave sort of more of a, not so much science talk, and today I'm going to give more of a science talk. And I wanted to start just by really thanking, highlighting the contributions of the folks that I work with. So up top is sort of my research program, and so these are sort of a combination of postdocs and mostly grad students. So this is, we're up around 12, now we're down to around 6 or so. That's sort of ideal size. But great guys and gals, really proud of all these folks. These are the groups that I'm sort of a part of, the Earth to Ocean group at SFU, and it's this group of aquatic ecologists who try to do science that applies to conservation management, and it ranges from coral reefs to sharks to rivers, and we have a sort of a collaborative teaching or mentoring or research program that's really exciting, and that's nested within SFU biology. My collaborators are sort of here in the middle, First Nations and government fisheries groups, and then funding comes from NSERC and an endowed research chair, Liber Era research chair, as well as some other sources. So what I wanted to do is actually just start with a video. I did that last night as well. This is a very different video. And this is one of the things I just love to do is stick my head in rivers. I highly recommend it. And so this is what you're going to see. So you stick your head in a river, and what you see is stuff flowing downstream. You see algae, maybe some sediment, and water, of course, flowing downstream. And we know this, and you might see a salmon there. You might see a salmon coming up soon. There's some salmon. More salmon. They smacked the camera just a little bit there. And so this is what I sort of got, this is what I work on. I work on streams. And so if you stick your head in a river, what you see is these flows. You see flows of water and sediments and probably the nutrients that water is carrying, the properties that water is carrying. That's all going downstream. And then if you're lucky, you might see flows the other direction, flows of migratory fish going back upstream. And so you look at a place like this, and honestly, for me, I struggle to get a sense for the sort of vast connections that are obviously defining river systems. You look at this place, and what you're experiencing is coming from somewhere else, either the ocean or the mountains above. And so today in this talk, what I'm going to be trying to do is sort of step back and take more of a holistic perspective on how I think about rivers. And I give this talk with some trepidation to this group because some of you folks are from the watershed group, and so your whole program is built around this idea that rivers are these sort of connected units that link the land to the water. And so that's sort of you might all know what I'm going to talk about, but we'll see. And so, I wanted to work on big rivers when I got to BC, and so this is a picture of one of the big rivers that I work on. This is the Skeena River. And so I drove up there, and it's hard to study this type of thing. It was hard. I struggled. So I got here, I'm like, wow, this is a river, and it's flowing from somewhere that I can't see, and the salmon are swimming by somewhere. It really was blowing my mind. I couldn't wrap my head around it. And then, and so this is just sort of a picture from, some DEM, yet really complicated landscape, enormous spatial scale. And this sort of challenge of scale, I think, is what I was butting my head up against. And this, I think, is a really fundamental challenge that really ecology and science struggles with in general. How do we force our science and our brains to wrap our heads around things that happen on maybe large time scales or large spatial scales that we really can't perceive that easily? And so I kind of had a semi-epiphany when I was reading some old papers by Luna Leopold and others that said, there's some similarities between rivers and trees. And so I was like, well, maybe I need to start thinking about rivers as trees. And so I just want to put that forth as a possible metaphor for sort of facilitating thinking about sort of whole river networks, if you will. And so rivers are like trees in that they have this sort of fractal branching pattern. This one's a little bit of an extreme example looking like a tree. But the bottom line is that rivers do coalesce. Tributaries join together, and then those bigger tributaries join together to form bigger ones. So you have this sort of pattern of coming together, just like a tree. You also have bidirectional connectivity. The base of the tree is connected to the leaves, and then vice versa. And it's connected by the flows of water and by the movements of migratory fish. Now, like any metaphor, we can pick this apart. The flows aren't exactly the same. It's not like, the phloem is not exactly similar to water, and so there's some differences. But for me, this really helped me conceptualize thinking about whole river systems. And so migratory fish, like salmon, have this life cycle that goes from the top of these river networks, the top branches, down to the base, and actually beyond the base, maybe to the roots, and then back again. And so these are the places I'll be talking about today, the Skeena, the Nass, and the Fraser. Big watersheds. This is Vancouver, and this is roughly where we are. And if you take those river networks and draw them out by hand, which I did, and then flip them up, imagine that they're sort of reaching up into the sky, this is what they'd look like. So here you have the Fraser, the Skeena, the Nass, and the Stikine up farther north. And this is this is space. This is 100 kilometers up. This is sort of the border between the atmosphere and space. And this is a satellite up here. It's so cool to think about working. So, you're standing at the bottom of the Fraser. And in essence, you're working at the base of a tree that's 500 kilometers long, that if you flipped it up, it'd be reaching up into the space, and satellites would get caught in the branches. That is so cool. And so what I'm going to try to address today is how this structure and how this scale of free-flowing river networks, how this influences their stability or resilience, and ultimately their management or conservation. Okay, so this is going to be the flow of the talk. Get it? Flow. I'm going to start out by talking about motivation. I'll then introduce this idea that I'm excited about. I'll present some evidence. Then I'll talk about sort of digging into the mechanisms, perhaps a little bit more of the patterns that we're seeing. And then I'll talk very briefly about some of the application of some of these ideas. So I'll be referring back to this sort of roadmap throughout the talk. Okay, so the motivation, I think, is that there's increasing evidence that variability is increasing. And I think this poses a huge fundamental challenge for how we manage natural resources. And how can we devise management strategies that are robust to variability, especially unpredictable variability? And so some specific examples are, this missing poster. The Fraser River sockeye just didn't come back like fisheries managers thought they were going to be coming back. That's some unpredictable fishery return, and it led to economic hardship. And then another example is a really high flow event in that breached the dikes along the Fraser River, damaged millions of dollars of infrastructure. So these are some of the sort of interfaces between variability of sort of natural systems like salmon and water and how we rely on those natural systems or are impacted by those natural systems. So how can we manage and conserve for stability, if you will? And I want to be careful with this because I don't think stability in river systems is something we want to strive for. I think natural flow regimes are naturally variable, so just give me a little bit of credit for that one. And I think there's increasing appreciation that the Earth's systems have some capacity to absorb perturbations. And so there's some evidence that suggests that intact mangrove forests provide a really strong natural defense system against tsunami waves. And so shorelines that had more intact mangroves were less affected by some of the more larger tsunamis in the recent past. And there's been some great work. Mary Ruckelshouse's group is involved in some of this work. I know she was a speaker here recently, really thinking about the sort of a capacity of Earth's systems to provide these defenses. And again, I just want to highlight the interface between the systems, main river systems that I'm talking about, and the cultures and the economies that rely on them. And so today I'll be talking some about First Nations fisheries and their stability. And so the lack of stability would mean, in turn, volatile catches, unpredictable catches, and economic hardship. So again, as more motivation, I want to step back and ask, well, so if we're interested in these big rivers, these big trees that would, pluck satellites out of the sky, let's just sort of step back and ask, well, what's their status in the world? And so I reanalyzed some of Nilsson's data from a Science or Nature paper and just plotted river, this sort of blur here is the names of all the rivers, as a function of size and whether or not they're quote-unquote free-flowing versus fragmented. And what you see is that the bigger rivers have a higher probability of being fragmented for both global rivers and Canadian rivers. So that's the first result. Big rivers, more likely to have major dams on them, for example. Not too surprising, perhaps. If it's bigger in area, there's just more places to dam, and there's more people living there, presumably. But it also highlights the sort of potential importance of thinking about, well, how do these sort of remaining large watersheds function? And another thing to highlight is that most of the large rivers in the world have been fragmented. And so this is a picture of one of the places I work. Again, I don't really know what the changes are that are happening, but it would be nice to know how much change can these systems absorb or dampen or deal with. Okay, so I talked about the motivation. Now I'm going to introduce this idea. And I'm going to introduce the idea that rivers might have this inherent ability to dampen variation. And I think this might provide this natural defense against variability. So I'm going to just do a simple thought experiment. And this is structured in a formal logical argument. This is developed by the Greeks. Basically, the theory is if the premise 1 is true and premise 2 is true, then it logically follows that the conclusion must be true. So for example, I might say premise 1 is that all people die. Premise 2 is I'm a person. The conclusion is I'm going to die. If that 1 is 2 and true is 2, then it logically follows that 3 is true. That's a little bit of a morbid example, but I think it's pretty undeniable. Okay, so I'm not sure if this is going to be quite as undeniable, but this is what I'm going to postulate. So premise 1 is that in river systems, downstream dynamics are a function of upstream dynamics. So say you have a blue river coming in and a red river coming in, downstream is going to be purple. Slightly simplistic. But we might look at a visual example of that. So this is the Thompson coming into the Fraser. Here we have this coffee-covered river coming in, and this sort of latte river coming in. And then downstream we have this sort of frappuccino latte, mochaccino type of thing. I'm from Seattle. I should know the names of these things, but I don't, unfortunately. So this mixing, it's pretty basic. This is, stuff travels downstream. But it's not just mixing of the amounts of materials, the amounts of sediments. It's also going to be mixing the dynamics. The wiggles through time should get mixed. And of course, it should be proportional to the flow contributions of the different tributaries coming through. So that's premise 1. I think that's kind of true. Premise 2 is that if you aggregate dynamics, you should get stability. So I'm sure all of you have really diverse stock portfolios. All you grad students invest all your huge earnings and diversify your stock portfolio. And as you all know, that diverse stock portfolio will produce more stable economic returns. Because if one of your investments, say you put half your money into Starbucks, if that investment goes down, but then you put half your money into IT and that one doesn't go down, then the aggregate will be more stable. And this has been mathematically shown for decades by economists who are usually way ahead of ecologists because, well, they're probably more motivated because of the money. So we have this premise 2 is this portfolio effect. Diverse aggregates should be more stable. So again, if we look at a red river wiggling around and a blue river wiggling around, if you average those, it should be less wiggly. It should be more stable. That variation should be dampened. And again, diverse portfolios are thought to be more stable. It does hinge on the fact that your assets, the components of your portfolio, are doing different things through time. And I'll revisit that later in the talk. And this has been shown in ecology for a while now as well. Dan Doak wrote a great paper in '98 building off of some of David Tillman's work on grasslands, where he said, well, it's a statistical inevitability. Mathematically, it has to happen that you get stability from diversity as long as you have the lack of perfect correlation or the lack of perfect synchrony. So here you have Dan Doak with a lizard and an equation. And what this equation is saying is that the variation of your portfolio should be the sum of the individual assets in your portfolio plus their covariation. And visually what that means is that the variation, as indicated by the coefficient of variation, the CV, should be lower as you increase species number, but that it'll depend on that level of asynchrony. So again, really strong math backing this idea that stability arises from diversity. And here I'm referring to stability in terms of dampened variation. What this means is pretty cool. What this means is that river networks should have this inherent dampening ability. It means that when two tributaries come together, downstream should be more stable, and you also should get this hierarchical pattern such that upstream is more variable than downstream. So those are the two predictions. Let's see if it's true. And so what we wanted to do is take this sort of broad brush approach and ask a bunch of different riverine dynamics. Does this prediction match reality? And the cool thing about this hypothesis is I think it could apply to a bunch of things: temperature, water, sediment, fisheries for migratory fishes, anything that aggregates across diversity. How do I get this out of here? There we go. So the first step we did is we used math. And we asked this question: let's just create some simple river networks, and then we'll ask questions like, how does predicted stability map on to these to populations that would be living in these river networks, governed by this branching pattern and by the directional flow. And so for this project, I worked with a bunch of really smart guys. Justin was my postdoc, really mathy guy. And then Paulo and Marcus are two Brazilian guys. He does sort of physics for fun, and then Paulo is this great network guy. And then there's me, who's just like, I like fish. But it was a super fun collaboration. Yeah. And so that was this paper that we just published. And what we did is, and when I say we, I mean Justin. What Justin did was he built these river networks and then asked, well, what's the predicted stability? And perhaps not surprisingly, what he found is that as you go down the river network, as you go from the sort of top towards the bottom, what you get is dampened variation. You get CVs that used to be high variability, and then down here you get more stability. And then we also found that it should be influenced by the network structure of the river as well, such that as you're bringing more branches together, you're aggregating more asynchronous dynamics, and that should stabilize the pattern even more. So that's what the math said. the math says, stability should increase downstream and with more branched river networks. So that's this idea, and now I want to try to look to see whether this is true or not. And so what we did is, as a lab project for a couple semesters, we decided to look for the signature of this pattern in the Fraser River watershed. And so during lab meeting, we sort of divided up into teams, and we're like, okay, you're the data team. The data team had the temp data team, the fisheries data team, and then the water flow data team. And then we had a lit review data team, and then we came together and wrote the paper. So this is a picture of the Fraser River. It's a big watershed, 220,000 square kilometers. It's mostly free-flowing. It has a couple dams on it way up high, but there's no major dams on the main stem. And so what we did is we predicted that variability would decrease as we increase the upstream catchment area. So as you go downstream, as you get more of a diverse portfolio, you're integrating more biological, more geological, more hydrological diversity, you should get lower coefficients of variation. And so we looked at this for flow, for temperature, and for First Nations fisheries. And the First Nations fisheries are scattered throughout the watershed, so they're going to be aggregating different salmon diversity. And so this is an example of the type of data we found. So if you look at this coefficient of variation of water flow, what you see is that up high in the tributaries, the water flow is more variable through time. And this is using 40 years of data for each site. So each one of these is a site throughout the Fraser watershed. This is way down near Vancouver, aggregating the whole watershed. This is somewhere, some small trib. So way up high, variable, and then that more stable towards the base. This is cool. This isn't exactly novel. This has been shown actually a while ago that small streams tend to be more flashy than larger streams. It hasn't really been couched in this sort of portfolio language before. We also converted these to the probability of extreme events that we thought might impact people. And so as a reference point here, we compared the sort of magnitude, the relative magnitude, so it's a proportion, of the Hope flood, which overtopped this dike and ravaged the lower Fraser. And what we found is that on average, over the whole time series, these big, flashy, rare events, they're not really rare actually in these small catchments. These systems are more volatile than down here. Not all systems, of course. Up here, we probably have some of these, spring-fed systems that are stable. There's a lot of important realities to this, but the overall pattern is consistent with our prediction. We can then map out watershed stability, so we can see in blue is more stable flows, in red is highly variable flows, and the size of the point is proportional to the catchment area. And this is just sort of echoing the data, such that on the main stem, more diversity, hydrologic diversity in this case, is more stable for these bigger blue points, and then smaller tribs, whether they're down low in the watershed or whether they're high up in the watershed, they, on average, have more variability. And so this is this sort of master figure where we put all this data into one. And the pattern, there's different shapes, but the general pattern was the same. As you increase your catchment area, as you're aggregating more diversity, what you see is more stability for fisheries, for flows, and for water temperatures. So that was just one cut at the data, and that paper just got accepted to Ecology. But there's this is a huge data set, and so we're still trying to look at, what are the temporal scales at which these occur? And so we're starting to try to dig into that a little bit. This is a wavelet analysis where if you take the flow data from a site and plot the sort of temporal scale at which variability can happen, you can sort of see a lot of the variability happens with the sort of at this scale. So the heat here means the sort of the amount of variability, and then this is the scale at which the analysis happened, and this is the time here. So not surprisingly, a lot of the variability is happening on this sort of annual rise and fall of the freshet, but there's other longer-term variability too. And so what we've done is we've done this type of wavelet analysis and then difference things to figure out at what scale is variability being absorbed. And it turns out that it doesn't actually absorb this sort of spring freshet variability very much. It does a little bit, but it absorbs quite a bit of the higher frequency, storm flashiness variability, as well as some of the longer term, El Nino-y type of variability. Another thing you can do that's kind of fun is you can actually turn the data into sound. So what I'm going to do now is play one representative 40-year time series of flow data. And this is comparing a place higher up in the watershed to more of a main stem sound. Isn't that cool? So that's the sort of heartbeat of the river. That's the annual rise and fall. The sort of scratchiness is these sort of weird, gnarly flow events, the sort of high flow, flashy events. So that's up higher. Remember that? And then this is down lower. More predictable. Just boom, 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 boom. Sounds like a heartbeat, right? I think that's so cool. It's not really science, but it's super fun. Oops. Where am I? Okay, and we're still digging into this. I think this is a sort of a rich area that I'm excited about the lab keeping on working on. I have a new PhD student who's asking the question, well, how does this sort of idea apply to a known perturbation like climate change? How do river networks absorb climate change? And so what he's done is he's looking at that flow data that we've accumulated, and he's asked, well, how is snowmelt getting earlier or later? And so he's estimated peak snowmelt, and then over time, over the 40 years of the time series, he's asked, for each site within the Fraser, is snowmelt getting earlier or later? And so this is really preliminary, but what he's found is that if you look at the catchment area, so this is small catchments, some sites have snowmelt that's getting earlier. So that's what this point shows. This is change in timing of runoff. This is how many days per year it's changed over the last 40 years. So this one, snowmelt's gotten a lot earlier. This uncertainty is a coefficient uncertainty. This one actually has gotten later. So some of the small catchments are responding on long time scales. Some things seem like they're advancing. Some things seem like they're actually getting later. But as you go downstream, that all gets attenuated. Down at the bottom, there's actually not much of a long-term climate signal at all. It seems like it's not significantly different than zero. There isn't a substantial change in the hydrologic timing of snowmelt over time. So what I think this is saying is that river networks basically naturally upscale climate change. We talk about downscaled climate models. I think river networks actually do the opposite. I think they sort of sense what's happening throughout the watershed, and that's what they're responding to. And so the whole sort of attenuation idea, the sort of whole stability idea, one of the key elements is the spatial scale of the disturbance. And so if the spatial scale of the perturbation is bigger than the watershed, it doesn't matter. The river is going to respond. But if the spatial scale is smaller than the watershed, then it can aggregate across that. And it seems like that is what is happening in this huge watershed in response to directional linear climate change. Similar patterns with response to ENSO and PDO as well. Super preliminary, but it's an exciting direction that we're exploring. So I think what these data are suggesting is that these large free-flowing rivers might have some capacity to provide natural defense against variability. So I want to dig in a little bit to this idea with one of the systems that we work on quite a bit, and that's First Nations catch of salmon fisheries. This is a picture from the Lower Fraser of a fishery for chum salmon, and this is work that one of my master's students, Holly, led. And so again, just to remind you, what we predicted is that fisheries that are up high in the watershed, they'd be pretty volatile, whereas fisheries down here that harvested salmon that went by there to spawn there, went by there to spawn there, went by there to spawn there, and went by there to spawn there, they'd have lots of populations to harvest. And if those populations are wiggling around differently through time, they'd be more stable. So that's prediction, and here's what we found as a reminder. Consistent with our actually hypothesis, remarkably. And so this is sort of echoing work that my former advisor Schindler has done up in Bristol Bay. There he compared statistically what the catches would be. And so there they have a sample size, they have one Bristol Bay, and they say that diversity is buffering the fishery, it's stabilizing the fishery. Here we're comparing across dozens of fisheries and providing further evidence that salmon population diversity within a species is stabilizing fisheries. But what does that mean? So here we sort of looked at the pattern of stability, but what aspects of biodiversity really matter? How is it that salmon populations are leading to stability? So if we revisit the sort of concept of how diversity can beget stability, one of the fundamental things is the degree of synchrony or the degree of correlation among your units of diversity, whether it's species or populations. And so if they're synchronous, and they're all doing the same thing through time, then richness does not lead stability. So that would be like investing everything, all your assets in stocks that did this exact same thing through time. In essence, that's not really diversifying your portfolio. In contrast, if your assets are doing different things through time, you might call it asynchrony or even response diversity, responding differently to a perturbation, then you can get stability. So then we can dig into this question of, well, what actually controls asynchrony, because we know mathematically that asynchrony leads to stability. So we've been doing that for Chinook and the Fraser. This is work by Doug Braun, who's I call him a postdoc hitman because he worked for me for a couple months. Just crank out, focus, take out that project. And what he found was pretty cool. And so he compiled a bunch of data for the Chinook, and what he looked at was the degree to which their populations are wiggling around through time. This is R. So up here, if you have a positive R, a positive correlation, that means that a pair of populations are responding very strongly through time, exactly the same way. Whereas here, if you have a negative correlation, this is a pair of populations that are responding differently through time. And what he found is that the genetic distance among populations was a very strong predictor of their asynchrony, such that if things were distant genetically, then they tended to be asynchronous, whereas if things were closely related, then they tended to be highly synced up. So I think this is evidence that genetic diversity is somehow linked to asynchrony. Now I think this is important from a management perspective because hatchery propagation is very common, and that can really quickly swamp local adaptation and overwhelm this type of diversity that might be unappreciated. I like to think of it as sort of hidden biodiversity. And then he went one step further and asked, well, one thing we might care about is ocean temperature. Maybe the ocean's warming, and we might want to know about, well, what happens when the ocean is warm one year? Can we get stability in regards to that? And what he found is, wow, we might be able to. So this life history of Chinook salmon, when the ocean is warm, its marine survival is better. And this life history of Chinook salmon, when the ocean is warm, its marine survival is lower. So what that means is that in years when the ocean is warm, this population is going to do crappy, but this population is going to do well. And if you have a fishery that can harvest either one of those, then your fishery might be stable through that perturbation. We don't exactly know what the mechanism is behind this. It's probably different migration pathways through the ocean. It's probably linked to some sort of subtle biodiversity that we don't really, some sort of behavioral difference that we don't really know about. Another thing we're digging into is other aspects of diversity, furthering our sort of work on life history diversity. Steelhead are something I love, and so we worked on a paper with some government scientists from the Skeena and the NAS. It's basically pretty basic science, quantifying diversity in terms of their life histories, and then asking how might that contribute to their stability. And what we found is, first of all, is there's lots of different ways that their life histories unfold. And so most of the fish, what this is a frequency distribution of the different life histories. Up here, more frequent life histories, and this is their, the different ranked life history. F means a year in fresh water, O means a year in the ocean, S means spawning. So what we have is most of them going, 3 years in fresh water, then they go to the ocean, then they come back to spawn. But then we have some other things like where they'll spend up to 4 years in fresh water. We had 2 years in fresh water. And then you get crazy individuals here that spend like 5 years in fresh water, 2 years in the ocean, spawn, then ocean, then spawn, then ocean, then spawn, then ocean, then spawn, then ocean again. So you have a lot of different pathways through time. And a lot of this, I'm sure, is a stochastic process, whether or not something gets eaten by a seal or an angler. But and some of it's environmental and some of it's genetic. But regardless of that, what we know is there's a lot of life history. And we can also, looking at this data through time, we've identified whether or not they have the same age at ocean entry really drives whether or not the life histories are correlated or not. And so diversity in the ocean entry timing leads to this asynchrony that we know leads to stability. And so I think the take-home from this section, if we dig into the system a little bit, the sort of fisheries system, First Nations or recreational fisheries, if we ask what level of diversity underpins stability, it seems like very fine scale level of diversity. This life history diversity, local adaptation, really speaking to the importance of intact habitats as well as locally adapted populations. Then I'm going to transition and just talk very briefly. I talked about this more last night, but talking about thinking about these connections and how they mean what they mean for sort of conservation efforts. And so the goal of this project was to link estuary habitat with inland salmon populations to just honestly to make those linkages. This habitat depends on this habitat. And what we found in this estuary that has a lot of proposed industrial development was that salmon use this estuary in high abundances, lots of species, and from throughout the watershed. So the estuary is linked to 26 populations of sockeye, 7 populations of chinook. And what that means is that this data, perhaps not surprisingly, but connects this tree. It provides evidence that this base is linked to places that are 500 kilometers away, and thus the fisheries rights for people that live 500 kilometers away are driven by habitats that far away. And one of the things I'm really excited about this work is it's really pointing towards, we need to think about both the downstream and the upstream effects of potential land use decisions. And I would argue that currently, if a study is done, if industry is proposing a project in one area, they'll usually work with the local people. But the fact is that area might influence resources that are hundreds, if not 1,000 kilometers away. So what that project has done, it has linked habitat protection with inland fish and the fisheries and their constitutional rights to those fisheries. Okay, so I'm going to end with some take-home messages. So the first take-home message is that I think that river networks provide a natural defense against variability. And I want to be careful with this a little bit, but I'm really excited about this idea. I teach stream ecology, and I couldn't really find this in the textbooks. And anyway, I think it's a pretty neat thing, and I don't really know where it's going to go. I'm sure it doesn't apply all the time, but I think it could have some pretty profound implications. I think that stability arises from the interconnectedness that happens in these large river systems, as well as intact habitat, as well as locally adapted populations. And so this could get messed up in lots of different ways. So you have this big network, it needs the connections, it needs that diversity, and so it's really easy to worry about how changes in the fundamental structure or connectedness of rivers or changes in the diversity of river systems will actually change their ability, it might compromise their ability to provide resilience to known or unknown perturbations. And I think what this is really hinting at is, and speaking to the watershed group, I'm sure you all know this, but there's a real need to align the scales of processes, the scales that are operating perhaps over hundreds, if not thousands of kilometers, with the proper scales of management. And I would argue that's pointing towards the watershed scale as the scale to align the natural scale of processes with the natural scale of management. Thanks a lot. Questions? Yeah.
So I really like this idea of kind of co-opting this diversity, stability, just the whole idea from like plant ecology. Mm-hmm. But it inevitably means you're going to run into the same problems that they ran into in terms of disentangling mechanisms.
Maybe.
And so
Yeah.
my main question is, are these rivers thinking of a tree, the trunk river, that part of it, is it more stable just because it's bigger?
Right.
Because, the variance scales at the mean, and you could it could just be that there's more stuff there. And, I mean, does it actually depend on the branches being different and responding in different ways, or would it happen anyway?
So you raise a couple really key points. The first point is a sort of whether the variance is scaling with the mean. And so for some of these processes, I think it's robust to have our estimate of variability be normalized by the mean. And I think for fisheries, it's cool. I think for water flows, it's cool. For river temperatures, it's super not cool. So for river temperature, we didn't use CV, we just used standard deviation, because river temperature, it's not like degrees Celsius scales with 0. That's somewhat of an imposed scale. So I think that's robust. I think the question about whether it's really the branchingness or whether it's just sort of the accumulation of variance, I don't know yet, and that's something I'm super excited about. As you go downstream, you're going to get more, and it really depends on the sort of how do rivers operate, how much of the variability is propagated downstream, and how much of it depends on the sort of local dynamics, right? And so as you go downstream, you get local dynamics that are going to add to the dynamics. Water's going to warm or cool or whatnot. And so it all depends on the sort of spatial scale of how rivers respond. Now, one of the things I'm super excited about that we haven't been able to do yet is to create this sort of mathematical null model where you take the data from the branches and then you predict the data to down below, and you actually ask quantitatively how well does this sort of framework predict reality. And that's the sort of next step that I think will be the sort of next level of rigor in testing the. But yeah, lots of cool nuances to the question that would be good to dig into. Yeah.
So I think you kind of assumed that the change in the variation we saw was all due to the portfolio effect. Is that right?
I don't think I said that.
I know you said that. That's the question.
No, I don't want to assume that. I think it's really, especially for temperature, I think it's well known that larger water bodies, they have higher heat capacity, and so they're going to heat up slower. So I want to be a little bit careful. What I can say is that the data is consistent with the hypothesis.
I think you can measure it. I think you can measure the portion of the change you see that's due to the portfolio effect, because the action's in the covariance curve.
Exactly.
You can ask how much that explains it if you didn't, and that would let you compare fish results and water results.
Yep.
And see how much of the mechanism is different.
Exactly. So the data set we have isn't good enough to do that, except for the First Nations fisheries data, because there we actually. So what you need to do that is you need to have your tributaries, and you need to have the downstream, the aggregation, right? You need to below the coalescence, and the data we have isn't good enough to do that, because that would lead us to the sort of null model approach where you could say, okay, we know how much covariance there is between our tribs, and then you can actually predict mathematically what it's going to be and match it up, and then ask how much variance that explains. So we don't have the data yet, but for the First Nation stuff we do. We have fisheries data in terms of the returns for Chinook, and we have the actual fisheries catches. So that's the next step. We haven't done that yet.
That would be an exciting step.
Yes, I'm excited about it too. I think I agree completely. Yeah, thanks. Other questions? Yeah.
On those plots you showed of watershed area versus CV,
Mm-hmm.
it looked like a threshold
Yeah.
response.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you play around with taking the Fraser and starting to sync up a number of tributaries, that would also show a threshold response. If we could, you're kind of getting at the idea of how many tributaries matter to this.
Yeah, I haven't done that yet. I think you could. It is really cool, right? You see this bam. Maybe we only need rivers that are 20,000 kilometers squared or something like that. And I don't know. I don't know why that is. I mean, one of the things that happens with the portfolio effect is you basically saturate the portfolio effect at some point. It doesn't at some point, diversity doesn't matter. And so I think that's what's driving that sort of bottoming out there, is that at some point, it's just everything has been sort of wiped out. That's not the fundamental underlying signal, which in this case is probably that sort of spring freshet that rise and fall. So I think that's what's driving that pattern, is the sort of large-scale forcing that's happening across the watershed. and that's the sort of shared variance across the watershed. Yeah, I'm going to stop there. Yeah, exactly. There's a hand over here somewhere. Yeah,
I raised
Peter?
it before, I think you might have answered it with Nancy's
Okay.
question, but what is the actual metric that you use for stability of the fish? Was it
It was
catch rates?
it was a CV of annual catch. So it was, annual harvest rate. And then we also had the probability of poor catch, and so that we used, I think, half of the mean catch for that year. And so that would be sort of an unexpectedly low catch for that site.
Did you have to struggle at all with the fact that that catch would have been determined by what happened 4 years before, based on the cohort strength or anything like that?
We didn't struggle with it. One might want to struggle with it. One of the things that's really interesting that I sort of glossed over with this is that, so I presented a Chinook salmon catch. And Chinook they don't have strong 4-year cycles. The sockeye data don't show this pattern, actually. And I think that's driven by these 4-year cycles. And so my grad student, Holly, she's writing up those data in more detail where we compare across species with different life histories. And it's really cool because sometimes it doesn't work. This pattern doesn't show up. And it is in the sockeye and the pink, which have these really strong boom-bust years. Perhaps not surprising mathematically where you share that variance. And for those, we did the analysis 2 ways. We yoinked out the dominant year class and just did it on the sort of strong year class analysis. So we looked at the variability that way as well as the variability across. Yeah.
So you had your grand synthesis slide, the one with 6 graphs.
Yes.
Right.
Yep.
Throw that back up.
Okay.
No, this isn't an animation, but. So what I'm intrigued by is that you integrated the 3 big watersheds of BC that are all undeveloped.
Uh-huh.
And then you drew a conclusion at the end of your talk, which was, so we need to think about industrialization of these kind of places.
Right.
So to me, the obvious comparison that would be fascinating would be to develop these same kind of plots for the Columbia.
Yep.
Because here you have the analogy to the Fraser, comparable size,
Yep.
one of the relatively least undeveloped. You got a wonderful data set here, and then the one next south is as industrially developed as you'll ever find.
Yep.
So will those plots look different, and how do you think the Columbia plots would look?
Yeah, great suggestion. So just to be clear, this is all within the Fraser. And so this is all, but that doesn't really matter too much. So comparing to the Columbia, I think would be fascinating. First of all, you think about dams, and that's one of the major alterations of the Columbia, right? And so dams oftentimes are built to stabilize flows. And so you stabilize flows, or you get hydroelectricity, or you hold flow back and you let it go. And so that's going to be a strong driver of these patterns of variability. I would guess that the CV of the flow of the Columbia is going to be down lower than the CV of the Fraser. So that's the sort of rough CV stuff. I think what would be really the fisheries data, I did one analysis with some of the Columbia River data sets, and what I found there was over the last 50 or 60 years, I can't remember, the salmon populations have gotten synced up. And so there I think you wouldn't see this type of pattern. You also wouldn't see the data because First Nations fisheries data don't really exist for within the watershed, unfortunately. But you wouldn't see that pattern stability, I would anticipate. The water temperature data, I don't really, the dam, again, I think the dam signal is going to be very strong because the reservoir is going to hold that water back. It's going to be pretty strong. What I think would be really cool, perhaps even cooler, is to do the sort of more, asking that type of data, what about the response to known perturbations like to PDO or like to climate change? And what I think you would see is that the homogenization of the sort of responses.
So you're less focused on the impact of dams and industrial facilities than the ability of large rivers to absorb climate change.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But I am, I guess, concerned might be the right word about the potential for sort of unnoticed alterations of river systems compromising the ability of them to sort of deal with these perturbations. Yeah. The dam thing, it's a bit of a can of worms that I haven't jumped into yet. Yeah.
So I guess this might go back to sort of what Andrew was asking about, which is mechanism. Shouldn't it be, I mean, are you interested in catchment area, or are you interested in the number of trips?
Right.
I mean, it seems like that's the more critical
Mm-hmm.
question. Like, you would want to, if you want to reproduce these graphs, you'd look at rivers with similar size catchment areas, but with different
Yeah.
numbers of tributaries.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yep.
Are you going to do that with?
We're doing that with the salmon data.
Okay.
Yep. And so with the salmon data, what we've done is we've asked the data, what's the best predictor of the stability? And it, of course, it depends a little bit, but number of populations that are integrated is a pretty good predictor. Upstream catchment area is a pretty good predictor. And those are the two ones that seem to fall out. In that analysis, we haven't confronted it with actual spawner data to get to the next sort of mechanistic understanding, like Nancy was suggesting earlier. Yeah, I think that's the next step. These are all great ideas. These are all directions we're sort of excited to go in that we haven't done yet. Yeah.
So, one of the big overarching theme, or overarching things, the conservation perspective on diversity and genetics of all the fishes that are going on. So does this kind of counter, can you use this to make arguments about stocking techniques and where you get your stocking populations from? And kind of say, hey, maybe we should promote stocking diversity for this very reason.
Yeah, so one of the unique things about, in particular the Skeena, is there's actually no hatcheries in the Skeena. And so that's one of the sort of rare big watersheds where there hasn't been sort of widespread stocking efforts. One of my friends down in California did this really amazing analysis where he got some data from fin clips back at the turn of the century. I think it's steelhead, maybe Chinook, but from up and down California. And what he did is he found, not surprisingly, back at the turn of the century, more distant populations were more distantly related, whereas nearby populations were very closely related to each other. And they went and redid all that, and what they found is it's flatlined. So now everything is similarly related. So down in California, they basically wiped out any sort of distance by genetic effect. They've homogenized those populations. So to me, that is one of the sort of implications of this, is that the sort of local adaptations, it's hard to replicate that kind of thing with stocking. And especially with Chinook or any of these salmonids, they don't use locally adapted populations oftentimes, as they get something that they like to catch and they make a lot of it and they put it everywhere. And that's what they've done in California. So yes, I think that is one of the implications. In terms of guiding the actual stocking efforts, I would suggest that they might guide them to not do very many of them. And we have a paper that's in press right now in Ecological Applications that's doing some fun stuff with a model where we're sort of playing with scenarios, and we're asking, so that we have this portfolio, if you will, of salmon that you're harvesting, what sort of management strategy should you use? Should you try to just sort of preserve the big populations? Should you just try to preserve a range of populations? And so you can play these type of games with a sort of portfolio framework to ask if we're interested in both sort of return, sort of productivity, as well as the stability of the return, what sort of portfolio should you want? And so that's something we're starting to do with sort of simulation-based, and we're hoping to add some reality to that to the future. We have incorporated hatchery propagation to that directly, but I think the sort of preserving one big population is somewhat analogous to that. Yeah.
So at the very beginning, you showed us, you said something about a network model approach, and you showed us a graph of a network kind of analysis.
Yep.
Then I don't think you showed us any results from that, is that right?
No, I think I did. They're very simplistic.
How did your network analysis compare with the correlation analysis you did?
The qualitative results were similar, such that farther downstream you get more stability, and that model also predicted that more branching led to more stability.
So you looked at upstream networks and downstream networks and compared them? Is that how you did that?
We compared sites within networks we built. That was one of the analysis for that. We also broke the networks, and so what we did is we'd build these trees, and then we'd make a link here, or we'd start breaking down the tree-like structure of it, and we could sort of examine how that would affect the stability. Another thing that we did that I didn't talk about at all is thinking about how, so stability also has to do with the ability of the system to sync up itself. And so when there's exchange of individuals, that's going to lead to the populations being more synchronous. And so that was another layer of the analysis, is asking how the network structure would actually promote or hinder the synchrony or asynchrony that leads to stability. And that was a neat part of the analysis as well.
But independent of that, you still found this pattern, the upstream, downstream pattern of damp variation.
Yeah.
So what was the deal with losing asynchrony? What caused you to lose asynchrony? Because that's the good variability, right?
Exactly.
Variability isn't all bad.
Yep.
That variability is the positive variability.
Yeah. So what we found there is that random networks that weren't tree-like, that had more connections, lost their asynchrony more. And so this tree-like structure means it's really pretty hard to propagate information across the branches. And because of that hindrance of the propagation of information, then it can preserve its asynchrony more than sort of randomly constructed networks. This is with the same number of nodes or the same number of branches. Yeah. So there's one of the things, yeah, so it's really neat. So there's basically dual stability, we think, of river networks. There's a stability, the sort of statistical dampening stability, and there's also the fact that it's going to lead to the asynchrony that allows for that dampened stability. And that's what we haven't tackled that part at all in terms of reality.
So the idea then is that a river is a really non-random kind of network because it's very linear and very modular.
Exactly.
Because of that, it's built to have separation of network parts.
Yep.
It can't be seen.
Yep.
Is that right?
Exactly. And one of the cool things that we've, in the branchiness, as I'm sure some of you know better than I do, the degree of branchiness is not random. And so river networks are sort of, you can get that degree of fractalness, if you will. And it turns out that that degree of fractalness is pretty darn good at being the sort of maximum amount of hindrance of synchronization, if you will. So it's really cool. It's kind of spooky. It's like the fact that these river networks, they evolved over geologic time to carve through the land, and they've created this branching structure. And if you look at the degree of how much branching there is, many rivers sort of conform to similar patterns. Those sort of exponents are some of the branching structures that are most resilient to synchronization. I'm not sure I described that well, but there's some pretty neat sort of physical mysteries going on here that we haven't quite wrapped our heads around yet. Yeah. Cool. Thanks, guys. That was fun.